Hi everyone, welcome along to webinar 5. This one's about getting practical, but as I'm presenting, this is Nick here, as I'm presenting, I'm going to hand over the reins to Ines now, who's going to take you through the introduction.
Hi everyone, thank you Nick. So as Nick says, welcome to the webinar. Some of you who have joined us before will know first we just go over the practicalities. Basically, we will first have the presentations. Everyone is on mute so that we don't get any unnecessary noise. But if you think of a question during one of the presentations, please just write your question in the question box. You will see on your right-hand side or somewhere on your screen a little sort of box, a little control panel, and you can type your question in there. We will see it, and then I will go through all the questions, and the presenters will of course answer after we've done the presentations. So you can wait until the presentations are done, but if you're worried you will forget your question, just type it in while people are speaking. If you have any kind of problem, please, you can also send a message or a question just to the organizers. So if the speakers are, let's say, speaking too fast, or, you know, if you're having any other issue, just send me a message and then I will pass it on to the speakers. Everything that is said today will be recorded and will be posted on Enil's YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel with a playlist with the webinars. So, you know, if you don't want to take notes or would like to share the webinar with somebody else, you will find it there. So I think that's it. Each presentation will be about 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, and then the rest of the time we'll have time for questions. So to move on, today we will have with us first Nic Crosby. Usually Nick is, of course, facilitating with me. Today he'll be sharing information about his work with us. So Nick is currently has his own consultancy, GatherBuildWork. Before that, he was working for a long time for In Control and other organizations. He will be sharing information his experience with children's services, self-directed support, and personal budgets with us today. Nick is from England. And then we have our second speaker, Julia Fitzpatrick from Scotland. Julia is the CEO of Horizon Housing, and she has been working alongside John Dalrymple in Scotland, who you might remember was our first presenter in our first webinar, for those of you who were there. And Julia will be talking about her work, which is about finding the right homes for people leaving institutions and people with support needs in need of housing. So this is what we'll hear today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nick to start with his presentation. Nick, your turn.
Thank you. Hi, hi again. So I'm going to quickly run through some things around self-directed support, explain a bit what self-directed support means and where it comes from, some of the things that we've started to understand. Most of my work's been with children and young people, families, and the services supporting them. But I've also worked alongside adult services, and many of the things that we talk about are the same in terms of how it can work for children and adults. There's some differences around families, but I'll talk those through as we go. Talk a little bit about the starting point where we start, talk a little bit about the personalized planning or person-centered planning and funding. So that means the personal and individual budgets. Some people call that personalized funding or personalized budgets. It's a bit like direct payments, but I'll explain that. And then a little bit about how we kind of, how it works through in a process. And in amongst all of this, there'll be some stories about what it means for different people and what it's meant for them in their lives now. So I think the first thing is really putting self-directed support into history. Its roots come out of the independent living movement, and the independent living movement came about in the early 60s, and was part of that was closing down the big institutions in America. So closing down the institutions, people started to speak up for themselves. And I guess around self-directed support, the real focus was, well, actually, independent living means things for people. How do services work? What do services have to do to give people a chance to have more choice and control in their lives? And for self-directed support, the real focus is citizenship, which I'll explain in a minute. That feeling of being able to be an active citizen, an active participant in the world and the community and the society, and that self-directed support is the way that services work to help people do that. So I think it's really important that self-directed support is something that's changed. Julia and I were both involved many years ago when it started to come about. Some of it comes out of the work in Scotland, actually, that John was talking about. And all of it's been as we've gone forward, we've understood better how it can all work. Citizenship, which is, I guess, is the outcome. If we think about what all this is about, well, what does it mean to us? Most of us have got active lives. Some of us need some support to do that. Most of us want to be, and if we think about what being a citizen means, it means that we're healthy. We've got good life, that's the tree on there. We've got love in our life. We've got some freedom. We've got some money. We've got a home. We can get help if we need it. And we've got a sense of purpose or a sense of who we are. Lots of people that we know, though, actually don't have that in their lives. Certainly when we're talking about people who are living in institutions across Europe or in America, they're not active citizens because they're denied love in their lives. They don't have freedom to make choices. They don't have money to get the support and buy the food. They don't have a place that they feel of as home. They don't get the help they need to be able to live independently. And so self-directed support is really saying, well, how can we bring citizenship to people or give people a chance to be active citizens? And this is how, so that kind of explains where self-directed support comes from. The two people down at the bottom there mentioned Simon Duffy and Wendy Perez. Wendy Perez is a really active self-advocate, person with learning disabilities in England. She and Simon was the kind of part of the, well, it was citizenship kind of grew from his thinking around self-directed support. So I think what you're seeing there is a picture and an understanding of citizenship that's been developed by self-advocates, people with learning disabilities, and many others who are working alongside them to kind of make sense of what all this means. Okay, so where do we start? I think when we started working with families, we knew bits and bobs about strength-based work, about solutions-focused social work, family group conferencing, which is really big in England. And we started to think that what we didn't want to do was to make a big list of the things that were wrong for a child or a family. That's, people talk about that as a deficit model. We found that that's really disempowering. There's nothing worse than having a meeting with somebody and they just make a big list of all the things that are wrong in your life or that you can't do. And so what we wanted to do was to actually say, well, actually, what's going well? What's strong? So the real focus for us was what's strong and not what is wrong. And we came up with this idea about real wealth. And we said that everybody has some of these things in this picture. People have assets, people have bits of money. People have networks of people, the family, relatives, relations, friends, neighbours. People have access to that community, to access to the world. They might think of that through IT. They have skills and knowledge, even though that's not what families were experiencing when they were talking to social workers. Actually, if social workers changed the conversation, they would find out that there were huge amounts of skills and knowledge in a family. And then the word in the middle there is resilience. And it's most easily explained as what helps a mum or a dad get up early in the morning to get their child ready, to get picked up by the bus, to go off to school. When they've not had any sleep, when their child's not been very well, when things aren't going well, parents always seem to have the strength to get up, and they're always there. And it's that sense of resilience. As individuals, we have that. It's the things that make us tick. It's the things that make us smile. It's the things that help us get through a long day. It might be feelings of love for somebody. It might be, some of us might have faith. Some of us might have just things that make us feel better about ourselves. The idea of this picture about real wealth was saying, well, what we want to do is to start thinking about all the things that are strong. It might be difficult to think about people in institutions as having strengths, but that's always because their lives have been lived through all the things they can't do and the things that they struggle with, rather than thinking actually, you know, Miho, a guy I met in Slovenia, who'd been in an institution from the age of 3, and he managed to get out of there with the support of some people I know when he was 50, about 7 years ago. And he was a really strong man, and he had a lot to give, and he got a job working in the university. He could speak English, he learned 2 languages. So actually, when he was given the chance, he showed he had a lot more strengths and a lot more real wealth in his life and a lot more ability than services have ever acknowledged. So although sometimes we might think actually people have got very little wealth, there are things, if we change the way that we talk to people and hear what they're saying, that actually start to say, actually, these people have got real strengths in their lives, and how can we think about those more, rather than just all the things that aren't working well. The other side of it is actually, when we think about the wider world out there, there's a way of thinking about it in terms of all the different things that we interact with. So all of us, use lots of things in the mainstream, in the universal world. That's like the town centre, the community centre, the pub, all these different things that actually all of us use. The hospital, A&E, accident and emergency, everybody uses those. Schools can be mainstream, schools should be mainstream. Those are the things that everybody uses, and most children and young people and families actually get all they need out of the mainstream and universal services. Next to that is the community. There's all that kind of informal stuff that happens in communities. So there's, there's the friendships that you might have. When you pop down the pub and you see the same person on a Friday evening, actually there's a sense of community. You feel like you belong. You feel like you get a bit of support actually from catching up with your friends on a Friday. I certainly do, and I will be this evening. It's that feeling of actually there's a lot out there in the community. There's a local youth club down the road. It's all funded by people doing fundraising. It supports lots of different, it's open to lots of young people in the town that I live in, and it's supported by the community. It's a kind of community resource. So there's those sorts of things. Then we're starting to think about, well, actually for some people, they need a bit more support. So what we call in England the targeted services or specific service, specialist services. Those are the kind of services, some of which we would want to change, like overnight stay services, like a hospital for people with learning disabilities, like an institution, that's a targeted service. Now, I'm not saying this is good, but it was just trying to understand the picture of how things are organised now, because then we can start to think about how it changes. And the last thing here is that for some children, young people, families, they need a lot more support. If they're going to be able to go to school in the mainstream, if they're going to be able to pop into town, if they're going to be able to have friends and things, then actually they need quite a lot more support. In self-directed support, that's where we start to see the funding and the individual support that gives people more choice and control to be able to get out into their local community, to be able to get out into the local mainstream of the world. I put this in because this was just a fun exercise we did with some students in Ljubljana about a month ago. And it's called Community Connecting, and it goes back to what I was saying about the local community. One of the things that we've often done, working alongside people who've been moving into residential homes or out of group homes into their own home, is spent a bit of time thinking about all the things that are out there in the local community. We call it community connecting or community mapping. And it's a case of, it's very much like the graphic, the picture there you can see. It's a picture of a local community, and you start to mark in all the different places. So you can mark in where the local shop is, and where the church is, or where the youth club is, or all those different things, where the allotments are. I remember doing this with one group in near London, and we were talking about the fact that this 2 or 3 guys had moved into a new home, and they were still having to get into a bus, into the kind of service bus, and travel a number of miles to go and get their hair cut, because that's where they'd always got their hair cut. And when we did the community connecting, it turned out that there was a barber shop just around the corner. Now, barber shops, whatever country they're in, they're all the same. Men go in there, have a really good chat, meet each other, and it becomes a bit of a community thing, and you're included, and you're turning up. And it's thinking that actually, if we think about what's in our local community, there's a lot more out there than we probably ever think about, because we're living in service land, in land where people just get support from services. We're not thinking about how people can be included. Now, this is a picture about, so that's where we start. So we start with thinking about what is strong, not what is wrong. We then think about all the stuff that's local and all the stuff out there, and how most of us always want to be out there in the mainstream and the universal, how some of us don't get that support at the moment. But if we could use that support, that's where we want to be doing stuff in our local communities, going to the local school, using the local doctors, going to the A&E if we need to, that sort of thing. Now, this picture here comes from lots and lots of work, and I've put links to the work with children and young people with really complicated support needs, some of whom were in institutions, and some of whom may well end up being placed in institutions because the support's not going very well for them where they live. And this is a simple way of saying, okay, well, what are the steps that need to happen to help people get more choice and control? And in the case of these children and young people, how can we stop them going into institutions, or how can we support them to move out as quickly as possible? So the first step is to listen and understand. That's that kind of thing of getting all the information together. We often say, when we're doing work with social workers or with students, it's kind of a question about what's a good day look like. It's not a list of all the things that you can't do, or the amount of support you need, or the number of hours, or anything like that. It's saying, actually, if you think about it with the people closest and who know you well, your family or others, what are the things that make for a really good day for you? Let's write down all the things that make a good day. And then if we can do more of those things on more days of a week, we're going to have less bad days. We also use two simple questions: what is working and what is not working. So we think about the things when it comes to support that are working really well and why they might be working well. You often find that a young person knows somebody really well and they get really good support, but sometimes when that support changes, they really struggle. So we get all this information together. Then you get a case of, okay, well, everybody's got to sit down and work out what we're going to do next. So you agree what's going to happen next. And I put the word in there, allocate, because that's where the individual funding comes in. So instead of making a plan about how the support is going to work, you actually say, this is how much money is available for your support. And then you write a plan. So you get the money before you have a plan. So you can think about lots of different ways that you might use that money. It doesn't all have to be on support. It could be a gym membership. It could be, I know a young person in Bristol who actually spends £25 a year on the rent for an allotment because she loves gardening. She's got mental health support needs. She actually finds gardening a really peaceful thing to be able to do. And everybody understands that it's really healthy for her to be out and about, so she uses some of her personal budget on to pay for an allotment. So when you get to the planning, this is when you start to do what people might understand as person-centered planning. It's that thing about how do we use all the information we've got? How do we use that picture of what's around mainstream, what's in the local community? We think about those community connecting maps, and we start putting it all together, and then we think about how we're going to use that money as well to make the plan work so that people can get on and live their life. And then the last step is learn and review. And in this case, learn and review is, it's not just, is it working okay, well, go away and do the same thing. It's like, what's happened over the last year? What can we learn? How can we make it better? How do we improve the support? And what have we learned about what works for this person? So that's a really simple way of understanding the steps from listening and understanding, getting to know somebody, allocating personal budget and the support people need to make a good plan, doing a really good person-centered plan, living life, and then having a review to find out how it's all worked. This is just a quote from a guy who did loads and loads of work around person-centered planning, but it's the best way, I think, of really saying what self-directed support is really. Listen deeply, search for capacity, build connection. I can't see all the words because there's things in the way. Whoa. Seek connection and be open to yes. And this guy, John O'Brien, there's lots of information. If you search him, you'll find out loads. But it's almost, that's the simplest way of understanding what self-directed support is, if you really wanted a simple quote. And it's one that me and a number of people I work with come back to again and again and again. Always search for capacities. Capacities is like strengths. So it's always search for strengths, seek connection, and be open to yes. So what does all this mean for Lara, having a person-centered plan? Lara is somebody I got to know who was had been living in an institution for the last 5 years. We were starting to plan with her to move home. And she'd had lots and lots of difficulty in her childhood, and she got into lots of trouble and had all sorts of other things going on for her. The most important thing for Lara, when we were thinking about planning, was actually what really works for Lara, rather than a big list of all the things that had gone wrong, rather than the reputation that she had at the institution. The colour blue was really important to her. She loves animals, and the most important thing for her with the people that she was being supported by was that there were people that she could go and have a hug and a cuddle with, because that's how she dealt with things when she wasn't feeling happy. The first step for Lara in making her person-centered plan was she made a scrapbook. And in the scrapbook, she put all the pictures of the things that she likes to do on a really good day. She put some pictures about her favorite hobbies. She put some pictures and some words about the really important people in her life. She told some stories about the things that she really enjoyed doing and the places she enjoyed going to. And sitting down and doing a plan with Lara, when she had that in front of her, she loved sharing all the stories. So I was sitting there writing stuff down, and she told me all the stories of all these different pictures, why blue was important to her. She supports Chelsea Football Club and all sorts of other things. And actually what it did was give me huge amounts of information that meant that when we came to writing the plan, this was very much Lara's plan. Thinking differently. So you've got a plan. Now it's a case of thinking about how you might use the budget. This guy here, the guy with the pint in his hand, he's an old man. He was one of the first people up in the northwest of England to get an individual budget. And he used to get his service from Meals on Wheels. So once a day, round about lunchtime, Meals on Wheels would roll up to the door and they would deliver a hot meal, put it on the table, check he was okay, and then leave again. And he ate his meal on his own. And he was obviously very isolated. And for older people, isolation is a big problem. So they used some of the budget to set up an agreement with a local pub just down the road, that the pub would put on a hot meal every day for this old guy and make sure that he, had a nice hot meal and catch up with him. And what that meant was that he got out every day, he had a nice hot meal, he caught up with a whole load of people, he became a local at the pub. And if he didn't turn up, then somebody would be immediately up there checking on him. So he was even safer. He felt cared for and he felt that he had friends. So the outcomes were really big, but it only cost £5 a day. It's a tiny amount of money for a really big win. And that's a big thing about person-centered planning and self-directed support. The story here is a young lad that I did some planning with many years ago. And he had a thing about lawnmowers, and he was obsessed by lawnmowers. He would talk about lawnmowers, he would dream about lawnmowers, he would collect pictures about lawnmowers, and he was an expert at taking lawnmowers apart. And in the old days, people would have said, well, we've got to stop that obsession. We can't talk about, don't talk about things like that. He's getting obsessed with it. But actually, why? That doesn't seem very fair when that's his passion. So what they did was they turned it around and they started going down to the tip, the recycling centre, where he could pick up broken lawnmowers and he'd bring them back, fix them and sell them to local people. And he started making a bit of extra money. And for him, for a young guy with autism, actually that was a really big deal. He felt valued and he was making, he had a job. So it's that thinking differently that comes with self-directed support. So good support for Jim means being supported by men and not women. I know I'm going to run out of time in a minute. Good support for Matthew. Matthew was a young guy at school who used to run away. And they used to have 2-to-1 staffing. So they'd have 2 staff in a room. Matthew would be in there, probably trying to get out of the room all the time. One person would be standing in front of the door. It would lead to restraint, it would lead to all sorts of problems. So what we did, the thinking differently there was, we recruited some staff to support Matthew who could run really fast. So we let Matthew run away, and actually these support workers ran alongside Matthew really quickly. Excuse me. And obviously it changed the whole thing. So Matthew stopped running away because he realized that actually he was just getting very tired from all the running because the people that were supporting him could run just as fast as he could. For Jonathan, it was a young guy who had a lot of support needs, and he was given, or he was offered, lots of overnight stays so that his mum and dad could have a break. But he used to get really stressed when this happened, and his mum and dad ended up not sending him to these overnight stays, but that meant that they never had a good night's sleep because Jonathan was up most of the night and mum or dad was up all night. So we started, instead of saying, okay, well, mum and dad need a break, the thinking differently there, the self-directed support was, how does Jonathan like to have a break? And Jonathan likes to have a break by sitting on the beaches in Northumberland. He sits on the beach, he loves the peace and quiet, he loves the white noise of the waves. And so we said, well, how do we use some funding to make that happen? And for Jonathan, that meant that we ended up getting him a camper van, and his support staff can take him away every weekend now, and he goes up to the beach. And it's a really peaceful time for him. He's really happy, which is unusual for Jonathan. And I got a letter from mum and dad saying, it's the first night that we've walked along the quayside in Newcastle in 5 years, knowing that Jonathan's very happy and safe. It was a small amount of money compared to what would have been spent if they'd used the overnight stay. It was just thinking differently. And I put the last bit in because actually we all know what good support is. We can all think of instances where we've had really good support from friends, when we've had a bad day or things have not been going right, and we can think about that. So actually we know what good support is. There's two examples there, two organisations in England who do really, really good person-centred support. I know people are often interested. If people do want introductions to these two guys, the guys at Beyond Limits or Orbis, I'm very happy to introduce. You can just send me an email afterwards. And here's some of the resources that I recommended if people want to find out more about self-directed support. So there's some information at the Centre for Welfare Reform, the Citizen Network, and then there's two pieces of work at In Control. One was about My Life, My Family, which you'll use some of the graphics that we've used in here, and then there's one about a new offer. And then there's from In Control Scotland, I put a line on there to a set of presentations they used with a group from Finland that visited recently. It's a really good explanation of all the different things that are happening in Scotland. I guess this presentation draws everything together from lots of work, and it draws in lots of what I've learned from working alongside many good people, and what they learned from working alongside people in the past. So thank you very much. I hope people have found that useful, and over to you, Ines.
Thank you very much, Nic. That was really helpful and yeah, practical and inspiring. I'm sure people will find useful. We have a couple of questions for you already, but I will leave them for later, for after Julia is done with her presentation. So now we'll go over to talking about housing, which is obviously key to people living independently in the community as well, having a place to live, having a home. As Nic mentioned in his little citizenship drawing. So Julia, over to you. Now you have your presentation is on, so it's working, so you can just go ahead and start.
Okay, thank you, Ines. Hello everyone, and thank you to Nic and Ines for the invitation to talk to you. For I suppose the next 20 minutes or so, I'm planning to do a whistle-stop introduction to Scotland's housing policy context and some of the ways that we have to help people or build houses or buy houses so that people don't have to live in institutions or that they can get out of them if they are in institutions. I've got more slides than I'm going to talk to, so I will skip over some, but that detail is there in case you're interested to follow that up later. I'm going to mention from time to time, I'm going to say Horizon this or Horizon that. The organisation that I work for is called Horizon Housing Association, and we're a housing charity with almost 1,000 homes across Scotland. And our main aim and purpose is to provide homes and communities where disabled people are and can be included. So we build and we buy homes for people in housing need generally. Some, but not all of those people are disabled or families which include a disabled person. And the point is that disabled people and their families should just be able to live in the same communities as anybody else. So that's what Horizon is about. So I just wanted to start with showing you one of the things that's driving Scotland's housing policy is what is happening to our population. And I think this is mirrored in quite a lot of countries, but obviously not in all of them, which is that we have a rapidly increasing population of people who are aged over 60, over 75, and what's not shown on this slide is an even steeper incline of people who are aged over 85. And it's a fairly obvious point that once people are over 75, there's a much higher likelihood that people will have a mobility impairment, and over 85 that people may have a cognitive impairment. So there's lots of thinking and planning going on in Scotland's policies and strategies about that relate to people having to plan for an aging population and a population that will be less and less able to get around just ordinary housing. What John will have spoken about last week was where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago with lots of disabled people living in institutions. And in a sense, the housing policy still hasn't caught up with the fact that if they want people to not live in institutions or go into institutions, we have to have accessible housing, and a proportion of that needs to be fully accessible for people who use wheelchairs. So there's quite a big gap between what people are saying and what the theory is in all these policies and strategies about independent living, inclusion, choice, control, self-directed support, and the practice, where there's still very little recognition of the human and the economic impact of people living in institutions. But just as importantly for Horizon is the human and economic impacts of people having got out of institutions and living in homes where they can't get in or out the front door, they can't get to the toilet with dignity, or they're being forced to share with 3 or 4 people that they haven't chosen to live with. And every time one of those people leaves, a stranger comes and lives with them. We have only one Scottish Government target in relation to housing, and that is build 50,000 homes between 2017 and 22. And within that, there isn't a single target for how many of those should be accessible. And there is still a lot of the discussion that I would say carries on discriminating effectively against disabled people. So what we and people like John and Nick and all of you, I'm sure, are trying to achieve is how do we have disabled people in the mainstream? And the picture on the left is Lennox Castle. And John may have spoken about this last week. That was an institution where loads and loads of disabled people lived, and it closed about 20 years ago. And on the right is a little girl called Kelly with her mum, Gina, who live in a purpose-built property built by Horizon. And I think the main thing here really is that 30 years ago, a child like Kelly would have ended up in somewhere like Lennox Castle because there tended not to be suitable homes and there weren't the systems of support around. They are still nothing like adequate, but they are so much better. And I think sometimes we forget how much better things are. So Kelly is really a part of the community that she lives in, and I'll show you a picture of a few more of those houses later. And the point is that she is getting to grow up in a home that means she can learn to do lots of things for herself, and to meet people and to be part and to meet the local children and to play with them, and everything just becomes ordinary. And that means, if we just put a kind of hard financial hat on it, that in years to come, Kelly will need much less support and paid support than she would otherwise, because she's already learning at the age of 5 or 6 to use technology in and around her home to help her move around independently, do things like open and close curtains, get on and off a toilet, all of that kind of thing. Scotland's housing profile is that most people own their own home. And about 30% of the properties are owned by housing associations, of which Horizon is one, and local authorities. And the problem we probably have, or one of the biggest problems, is that only that column at the end, the housing associations, have really been thinking and building in ways that can accommodate disabled people. They were the group that built for almost everybody coming out of institutions. So the finances for making that happen and the experience of that and the knowledge about it is quite locked up in people who are in those housing associations. And a lot of those learned about it 20 years ago and now, like me, are about to leave. But I'll tell you a bit more about the money. Okay, right, I'm just going to skip over the next bit. Actually, I'll just say a little bit about this slide. Part of that tenure profile and where the homes are is that mostly the houses being built and the existing homes, of which we have about, 2.7 million households in Scotland, very few of them are built in ways that a disabled person could comfortably live in. So we have a significant shortfall of suitable housing. And what that means is that people are living almost invisibly in unsuitable homes that they can't get in and out of. And we still have about 1,000 people who are lost in institutions, some in England, some in Wales, some in Scotland, where people can barely even tell you the number, but I think it's about 1,000. And we still very much, despite all the positive work around self-directed support, have systems which look to gatekeep and have people have to jump through hoops in order to get one of these very rare, suitable, accessible homes. And as I said before, there's fairly limited knowledge. So what I think there is a systemic discrimination for disabled people. Their housing opportunities are not as good as people who are not disabled. And we've recently had the Equality and Human Rights Commission produce a report on that called The Hidden Housing Crisis. And we and disability organisations and user-led organisations are working closely with the European and Human Rights Commission to address that discrimination. I'm not going to say much about this slide other than one of the other things that I think Scotland's actually been ahead of the game on is separating housing and support. And the reason that's important is that for people to be able to really benefit from self-directed support and all the things that Nic was talking about, if they live somewhere where, if anything changes around their support, they have to move, then they can't be in control. So Scotland's legal system is very enabling of allowing people to have full tenancy rights in their own home with the support arranged completely separately. How we manage that is a whole other presentation. The money. We are incredibly lucky compared to a lot of other countries in Europe and across the world. And although we moan about it all the time that we don't have enough money, in Scotland we have a government, and this is not true of England, we have a government that is absolutely committed to what they call social and affordable, genuinely affordable housing. And that means there is grant money available in quite high proportions of the cost of a house to housing associations like Horizon. So we try and find imaginative ways of getting hold of that money. And some of that money is targeted at housing associations for rent, some of it at private developers for housing to own, and there's mixes in between when you can partly own something. And there's a range of sources of support for individuals in order to be able to get help with finding the right home in the owner-occupied sector. And that's where people like Horizon can come in and try and work out how to broker and bridge the gap for that. So just wanted to explain then, how does that system work in practice? This is one of Horizon's housing developments, and there are 80 homes in the whole development. And one of the things you might be surprised to learn is that about 2 of those houses, and just in the ones that you can see, are occupied by disabled people, but there's about 8 other properties and flats where people who live there have other housing needs or had other housing needs, but they're not disabled. And what we were able to do was find the site. There was a whole area being cleared for regeneration in the east end of Glasgow. And we made connections with the Glasgow Centre for Inclusive Living and with the local authority social work department to find out who used to live in this area and would like to come back, but they're currently living in care homes, people who are stuck in hospital, people who are living far away from families, but they originally came from this area. So one of those was the family that you see on the right, and in the middle is John Paul. And John Paul was living in a care home, costing Scotland quite a lot because that care home was in England. But he had, as you can see there, an extended family who had been fighting for quite a long time to have John Paul back home in Glasgow. So what we were able to do is use some of that grant money that was available to take one of the 2-story houses that actually was going to provide 4 one-bedroom flats. And we've converted that into a 5-bedroomed home with 2 lifts in it, 3 bathrooms, and the whole extended family now lives there, from grandchildren to siblings to the grandparents. And that has moved from a situation where John Paul was living in a care home, probably costing £100,000 to £150,000 a year, to him living surrounded by family, and there is paid support, but nothing like there was before, because he's living not almost with family care, but just as part of a family, and he now has a life. And I think the smiles on the rest of the group show that everybody thinks this is better for everybody. This is Barry, and just another example here. Well, this was a care home that a support provider and a local authority wanted to close that had 40 people living in it. And in this situation, I suppose an example of what John was talking about before, of everybody going around for quite a long time wanting to close a home, but thinking, where are people going to live? What can we do? And eventually going and talking to 2 housing associations, of which Horizon was one. And both of us had sites to develop actually in the same town as the care home that was closing. And we entered into a partnership with the local authority and the support provider that said, we'll build here and we'll reserve 35 of the homes across the 2 sites. I think there were probably 100 homes being built in all, or 120. And the support provider put in some money so that they, for the next 20 years, could have the right to say, here's somebody else who needs a suitable home, and they effectively get an automatic pass into that home if any of them are vacated. So there's actually a book that got written called I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, about 10 of the stories from the people who moved from that home. And all of them, I mean, the title of it says what it's about. All of them went to a situation where working with support, really along the kind of things Nic's just been talking about, they have managed to have their families back involved in their lives and to become part of the community and basically just to choose to do what they want. And the support providers work in the way that Nic has described, around people using money to do the things they like. And if that's to go out to a fair for the day, that's what they do. Similar situation, this is Tommy. Tommy went into a care home when he was 5, and this was a different situation where Horizon actually owned the care home and released it to the care provider. But we agreed this was not how people should be living. And this was about 15 years ago, closed the care home and again had a new development, which built a purpose-built home with a carport. There's a lovely picture of Tommy with his van in the carport. Again, what you can't see here is that just out of this is a small walkway over to the main shopping area in the town where Tommy lives. And he has written several times about the difference it has made to him just living in an ordinary street in an ordinary community. And one of the things I've really enjoyed since I came to Horizon and talking to him is that he is the biggest advocate for us allowing children to play everywhere when other tenants are saying they shouldn't be playing in the street. And he did, so there's that thing about he's part of a community and he's having a voice and a say in how that community should act and be together. Very quickly, because I'm running out of time, I'm sure. This is just an example where this is Claire and her family. They had been in really unsuitable housing, and there's other grant mechanisms available where, and actually in this case we didn't use a grant. Horizon just used its own money and joined it with the family's money to buy the house that they're standing in front of and adapt it for Claire so that she's got a sensory room and lots of things going on inside the house. But again, back to what Nic was talking about, families can have assets, and lots of times the systems ignore that maybe they don't have enough, but they've got some, and maybe we can put things together and find something that will suit everybody. This family's now been living in that house for 5 years, and they never stop finding ways to change it to make it better for Claire. So just finally, really, it isn't once and for all. It's really important that people's needs change over time. One of the dangers is that people get the right house and people think, well, they'll have to stay there forever. It isn't one solution. It's different things for different people. At a strategy level, Scotland needs to get much, much better at working out how it develops the systems it's got so it can be more responsive. And finally, it's not just about the bricks and mortar. It's about having the right house in the right place, and the social and amenity and the support networks that go around that. So I'll stop there and we'll be delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was really useful and interesting as well to hear about the work you're doing in Scotland. And like you say, I think you're quite a bit ahead of a lot of countries, both in terms of policy and also the government support for housing and the funding available. So, but I might have a question for you as well, but I'll first, we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So I'll start with the question. I'll start with the question for Nic from Cesar. Nic Cesar is asking how can a person with dementia and Alzheimer's lead a life included in the community? What kind of support would they need. So how would you do, you know, person-centered planning or self-directed support with somebody, with these conditions?
Okay, I think the first one, it's a good chance to, there's a bit of background, is to use it as a chance to plug a webinar that we've been talking about with Lucia and Miroslav in Slovakia about dementia-friendly villages and some work they've been doing with some people in Italy. So watch out for that, Cesar, because that will give you some real hands-on examples. Sorry, there's some background noise I'm getting, but the second one is or the real point is, I guess it's all about. Can I just go back to a slide, because it's really easy to think about this one. It's all about the how it's not just about people getting the right support, but it's about communities being more welcoming and inclusive. So there's a webinar with a guy called Ralph Broad at the end of July that we're running, and he's going to talk about local area coordination, which is a way of helping people be more connected into their community. And a lot of the work he's been doing has been around older people, and it's about being really active in thinking with others in the community about what they can do. So there are in the local town I live in, there's a network of volunteers, all of whom give over a few hours every week to go and spend time with older people in the local community. It might be to do some shopping, it might be just to have a cup of tea and pass the time of day. It might be to do all sorts. So there's something around the community. There's also something around the mainstream and the universal. So an example of that, it's not the same age group, but there was a lot of money put into disabled children's services a few years ago, and some places were really innovative. Instead of building special schools or special resources, they actually invested in local leisure centres, and they made those leisure centres, they provided changing spaces in those local leisure centres. They put hoists into those local leisure centres so that people could use a swimming pool. And it's that same sort of thing. So it's not simply about good person-centered planning and individual budgets. It's also thinking about how the world can be more welcoming to people who might have different support needs. And I guess the final bit is, going back to the self-directed support bit, is it's very much the same sort of questions. So people with dementia and Alzheimer's, or people with complicated mental health support needs, or very challenging health conditions, they all have important people in their life, or they would all like to be able to spend more time with those people that they love and who love them. They will all have memories of happy things and good things in their life. They will all have, we all know that people in those situations often become more isolated. So you're immediately starting to think about, how do you make a plan where somebody who finds the world a difficult place to live in because they've got dementia or Alzheimer's, how do they spend more time with the important people in their life? How do they do some of the things that they've always really enjoyed doing? How do they, how can they be supported to get out from their own home, because often they'll end up quite isolated, and do make sure they get to the doctors, have a morning down at the local cafe where other couples or people with similar support needs can spend time together. It's a very different way of doing things. So, and self-directed support really has been shown to make a difference for older people. It's not just about disabled people, it's about all those, it's about anybody with additional support needs. I do a lot of work around looked after children who've had very abusive and traumatic lives early in their life, and have obviously bear some of the scars of those experiences. And we still use self-directed support as the basis. We still start with the question, what would it take to have more good days? And it's the same thing. So the process works. It's the discussion and the thinking differently. The story about the guy with the pint and the lunch down the pub. Those people that would pop up if you didn't turn up, you're immediately doing something very different and very individual for somebody who's got probably, is getting older. So I think that it's exactly the same sorts of questions, same way of funding, and that real emphasis on thinking differently. Sorry, that was quite a long answer, but I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Back to where we are.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. I think that was. I'm sure Cesar is happy with that answer. I have a question for Julia. We have one question again from Cesar, but if I can just ask my questions, Julia. I was wondering how you would, often when talking about housing, I mean the governments or whoever is in charge will say that is too expensive or impossible to build individual homes for people, so they tend to stick people into group homes. So I was wondering what kind of arguments you would use to against that kind of lack of funding argument. I mean, and maybe you have experience from Scotland. How do you prevent basically group homes being built? How do you ensure that it's really homes for individuals or where they can stay with their families or friends? And the second part of the question is, how do you ensure that you don't create segregated communities, so that you don't have a lot of, if you have a plot of land or something, that you don't end up actually with a lot of, housing just for disabled people? What kind of systems do you have in place, or does the policy?
Okay, I think both of those are really good questions, because those are the kind of forces that we are constantly fighting against in both those cases. So having made quite a lot of progress at the times of the long stay institutions closing, or some of them, what happened then was that an awful lot of people were moved into group homes. We actually have 2, but used to have about 5. So because they were seen as, this is how we get the hospitals closed. I in my defence, I was not around when those decisions were made for group homes, and I've since got 3 of them closed. But part of the argument we would make now, I think, is that we've got the experience of what happens over time, and what seems like an economic way to do things in the beginning doesn't turn out like that in the end, because people's needs change. And to put, people 3 or 4 people together, and in some cases 6 people, the chances of that enduring without some major issue for at least 1 or 2 of the people in the household is really slim. And we have found individualized housing solutions for an awful lot of people. In fact, I didn't have time to tell you one of the stories where the reason we're doing that is because the group home situation broke down. They end up in hospital for assessment. They're still there 3 years later, or 5 years later, or in one case 9 years later, at all of the cost of that. So one of the bits that's really hard is getting people to think in a whole system economic way. Because what people look at is just the bit around how much does it cost for, an individualized support. The other thing that we're making increasing use of is technology. Because if the build and the technology is done in the right way, part of what it is about people getting away from the idea of risk. I think we've found that people are lumped together in houses of 3 and 4 people because people are saying it's the only way they can afford to have 24-hour care or support, because they're not prepared to take the risk of a different kind of overnight support, which might be might be remotely or an on-call system, or to give people the time of having that until they have somebody actually sleeping in the house and then withdrawing that over time. So I don't know if that helps. It is a struggle. I think the argument, the other one about segregated. So I'm getting an echo here. The other one about segregated versus specialist is again an ongoing, not argument, but an ongoing sort of need to keep reminding people that that's not what we're trying to do. We're working at the moment with the Scottish Government on a new design guide, and part of that design guide we're wanting to have that you do not clump together half a dozen houses for wheelchair users at the end of a development and then say you're building housing in the community. It needs to be designed in a way that housing is integrated into visually, and then that follows much more. It's much more likely then that inclusion will happen than that everybody looks at the houses and goes, those are where disabled people live, or those are where people with dementia live. So through design guides to architects is one way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Julia, thank you, that does. I'm just taking some notes as well. And I have 2 more questions for you. They're from 2 different people, but I'm going to sort of lump them together because I need to switch off my mic as well. I think that's where the echo comes from. So one is again from Cesar. He is asking basically, what is the role of, how important is it to have the right type of legislation besides the money issue? How important is it, from your experience in Scotland, to have the right type of legislation? And the second question is from Nadia, is how do you start when not all the services exist and there is no budget? That's an easy one.
Okay, I'll take the first one, then I'll probably need you to say the second one again. The role of legislation, very, very important. If the legislation is correctly framed, you would hope to never have to use it, but we do often use it to, don't generally end up going to court or anything, but we found it very useful in individual cases to be able to point to bits of legislation and say to those who should be commissioning services or those who should be building things, that the legislation says X, but you're not delivering Y, and therefore putting pressure on through the legislation. That's kind of the negative side of it. The other very positive aspect of legislation, and which we found in some bits of housing legislation, is that it sets down requirements of everybody. So a good example is that if somebody the legislation in Scotland means that if somebody lives in their own home and pays rent, they have full tenancy rights. And it doesn't matter if somebody comes along and says, oh, well, they're not able to contract, they're not able to do this or that, then you can use other bits of legislation, because we have the Adults with Incapacity Act, to say, well, there's a way that we can address that. And the reason the legislation is there is because the government wants to push a policy that is about rights. And sometimes you have to remind them of that, but the legislation is there and that's what the intent is. So that was the first one.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Julia. So the second question is basically, how do you start if you don't have, the funding in place, if you don't have, I suppose, the policies or the legislation in place, as you don't in a lot of countries. So maybe is there, maybe from your experience in Scotland, before, you've had everything in place, is there something you can do to start, making sure that people get the right housing? And I suppose, Nic, you can answer this question as well when it comes to self-directed support. Before the services, all these services exist, how do you go about planning with individuals?
Shall I pitch in first? I think I'm going to guess that we're probably going to say similar things. I think we started in England with no legislation, no policy, and pretty much no money. What we did was we started working with a very small group of for children. It was before there was any evidence that self-directed support worked at all. We met some families in Newcastle. So the families really wanted to do something different because their children weren't getting the support they needed. And we found a service, a local authority service, that wanted to do something different. And we literally started, I think we started with 4 families, and we started by doing a plan. We worked with the people who managed the money, and we managed to work out how much money was being spent on those children. And then we had a great manager within the local authority called Pat, who said, right, we're going to make this happen. We did have some legislation around direct payments, so people could have money individually, but that was very much around the hours of support. So we changed that to meaning we can use the money in lots of different ways. Jonathan, the story there that you heard about the camper van, he was one of those young people, or one of those families. And we decided that rather than spending the £16,000 that was going to be allocated to him to get the support that that services thought he needed, we could use it differently. We didn't spend all the money at all. We didn't need to, because we managed to do things in a different way. So from those 4 families, we ended up growing that piece of work to working with about 50 local authorities across England. And then we managed to get the government to invest in a pilot. And then we made the case to the government that they needed to move from a pilot or a test and actually make it into legislation. In 2014, we got individual budgets written into policy for all disabled children and young people as an option for families. I would say that it hasn't gone quite how we would like it. Their services still struggle with ideas like camper vans and gym memberships and holidays, but they're getting there. It takes a long time because you're trying to change culture. But how we started, we didn't start with any money. I was given a job, but I didn't have any, I wasn't being paid for that job, and we had no money to run a project. We literally grew it from working with 4 families in Newcastle. And the wider introduction of self-directed support for adults, which started in 2003 within Control, grew the same way. The first story was a guy called Joe Tomlinson in Wigan. They made it work for Joe, and from there it's grown into national policy for adults who need support from social care. Over to you, Julia.
I think you're right, Nic. I'll probably echo all of that. I'm actually just looking at one of the slides I didn't manage to show, and I'll start with the bottom bit of that, which said to make it work, persistence, patience, and belief. And the role, I think, that of individuals themselves who want to make it happen, their families and other strong advocates around them, is where to start. A couple of days ago, I was up in the north of Scotland and visiting a family whose son is now a rather frightening 20. But when he was 10 or even younger, I met his father, and it took 4 or 5 years to find and unpick the money and get the support to get the house that they needed so that the child could live at home. And that father, Angus, he just never gave up. And I think there's something about having a circle of people around someone who help them never give up, and they have to be people who don't give up either. And the other bit I think is about, in terms of money, is there will always be people who know where money is buried. And I think finding them can be quite useful as well. And just the partnerships of finding people who know their way around and who can help open doors. And part of that persistence, I think, is that sometimes that can take years and years and years to find those people and then put them around the situation.
Thank you very much, Julia and Nick. I think so. We can conclude it's not easy, but you do get there eventually. Suppose that would be the conclusion for me. We don't have. We just have some thanks, from the participants for the presentations and the comment that you make beautiful homes, Julia. But we don't have any other questions, so I suppose I would start wrapping up. So thank you, first of all, very much to Nick and Julia for sharing their experiences and for answering our questions. We can, if you do, for those of you who are listening in today, if you do have a question later, please feel free to email Nick or myself or Julia directly, and we will try to answer quickly. Nick will send around the link to the recording of the webinar and the slides, if you would like to go over them again. And yes, if you have any, suggestions or any queries particular to your country or the work that you are doing, just do let us know, and we'll try to help. So I think, yes, this is actually today's webinar, but not to forget, these are monthly webinars. So the next webinar is actually on the 29th of June, and this is going to be about young people leading the way. So we will have some young people from Euro Mental Health and from ENIL, in fact, from Greece and Turkey, sharing a bit about the work they are doing around deinstitutionalization, because it is very important, obviously, that young people also get involved in this, shall I say, struggle and continue the work. So that's on the 29th of June. The link to the webinar will be sent to register for the webinar will be sent around as well. And then we will have another webinar before the summer at the end of July, which is going to be about supporting people with complex needs, complex support needs. And then we will have a little break over the summer in August. Otherwise, just the final point is we are organizing these webinars as part of our work, the European Coalition for Community Living, which is run by ENIL with the help of Nic, the GatherBuildWork. And we have a mailing list with people from over 20 countries. What Nic does is he adds people who have taken part in the webinars to this mailing list. But please feel free to share the information with others who are working in this area or might find it useful. Or people who can actually who make decisions in your country and would find it useful. So we are trying to grow ECCL as a useful, as a resource, as a network, as a kind of group of people who can support each other when it comes to closing institutions and developing and supporting people to live in the community. So that's all for me. I will just let Nic as well say goodbye. Thank you very much again for everyone who stayed here with us today until now.
Thanks a lot for listening. When I click, or when Ines and I click the close button, it all goes very quiet very suddenly. So look forward to catching up, and a big thank you to Julia for your time as well, Julia. And we will send around everything later today or on Monday as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you. Bye, Nic. You can close.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.